Thanks, Ben. I'd also like to welcome everyone to Seattle. I love living here, and this is part of the reason why. And I don't think Ben mentioned it, but we have some incredible weather on tap for those of you who have come from out of town. For those of you who live here, it'll be beastly hot, but for the rest of you, it'll be quite nice. I knew having John start off this conference would lead to everybody thinking differently about adolescence, and I think he's accomplished that for us. He's certainly got me thinking differently, and I think his comments will nicely ground the discussion of both myself and the next three speakers. Rich, is there a way to get it on the screen here? Oh, there it is. Okay, I'll ignore this then. All right. What I want to do is, the title of my talk is Asking the Right Questions and what the implications for adolescent decision-making of that. And the short answer to this is that I think in bioethics in particular, we've been asking the wrong questions about adolescent capacity to make decisions. And hopefully at the end of my 30 minutes, I'll have suggested why that is. So where am I going with this talk? I'm going to first start with a couple of cases, and then discuss our current approach to adolescent decision-making, which I'll suggest is an autonomy-based approach in terms of deciding when, say, a 14 or a 16-year-old is capable of making medical decisions that ought to be abided by. Then I'm going to say a little bit about the adolescent brain, which will be more simplistic than what Dr. Medina has just done, but I think consistent with much of what he's said. And finally, suggest a more nuanced approach to understanding adolescent decision-making and how that might impact the way we approach adolescents who perhaps don't want to follow suggested medical regimens. So first, some cases. I want to start with a couple of cases that many of you will be familiar with, in part because I think it grounds the discussion quite well. In the last several months, the media has been full of reports about a young man named Daniel Hauser, a 13-year-old who lives in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. Daniel was recently diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, given a 90% chance of cure with conventional therapy, and had already undergone one round of chemotherapy. Daniel also considers himself to be a medicine man in the church, and a church elder in something known as Nimanha, which is an American Indian religious organization. Now, after having gone through one episode of chemotherapy, Daniel apparently was feeling considerably better and started making claims with the support of his parents that further treatment would violate his religious beliefs, that in his mind chemotherapy is self-destructive and poisonous, and he expressed a desire to pursue an alternative regimen of complementary medicine, which included dietary changes and ionized water. He further stated that he would punch and fight if he was challenged and forced to undergo chemotherapy. Daniel's case was challenged in court. The district judge spent a fair amount of time with Daniel trying to determine whether he was mature enough to make this decision, and came to the following conclusions. First of all, that Daniel does not believe he's currently ill, probably in large part because the first round of chemotherapy had made him feel considerably better. That he had a rudimentary understanding at best, of the risks and benefits of chemotherapy, and therefore was not a mature enough minor to make this sort of decision. He therefore ordered Daniel and his mother to report for a chest x-ray to assess the progression of his disease, to select an oncologist, and to follow the instructions of that oncologist. And what the judge said was that unless the tumor had advanced to the point where chemotherapy would not help, the family had to agree to treatment. If Daniel or the family refused, he would be placed in temporary custody. And at that point, what became very newsworthy was that Daniel and his mother disappeared, headed for the border, and ultimately ended up coming back of their own accord to Minnesota, where presumably Daniel is currently being treated. In another case, which is near and dear to the hearts of those of us in Seattle, a young man named Dennis Lindberg, who was, I believe, 14 at the time, described himself as a practicing Jehovah's Witness. Dennis had been put in the custody of his aunt. His parents had lost custody because of drug use issues. And his parents were not Jehovah's Witnesses. His aunt, however, was, and shortly after joining her home, living with her, he converted to the Jehovah's Witness religion, and shortly thereafter was diagnosed with acute lymphocytic leukemia. In his case, he was given a 70% chance of long-term cure if he underwent the prescribed regimen. Now, as most people know, treatment for leukemia destroys most of the blood cells, and therefore these kids inevitably will need transfusions. Chemotherapy was started in Daniel's case. Because of low blood counts, it was stopped, and at that point, the stalemate occurred, which was that Daniel said, Dennis said, rather, I don't want transfusions, and the oncology team said, well, we can't continue to treat you without transfusions, and as a matter of fact, we've treated you to past the point of no return. Dennis persisted in his objection. He, similar to Daniel Hauser, suggested that he would use physical as well as verbal resistance if there was an attempt to transfuse him. In Dennis's case, this went to the Skagit County Superior Court judge of Washington State, and in this case, the judge decided that after having heard testimony, he felt Dennis was a mature minor, knew the consequences of his decision, knew what he was doing, knew that he would die without a transfusion, and allowed him to be the decision maker. And within about 24 hours, Dennis Lindberg had died of a low red blood cell count. So given those two cases, two very different court rulings, I want to now talk about what our current approach is to thinking about when an adolescent might or might not make the sort of medical decision that ought to be respected. And I'm going to suggest that in the background here is a notion I think we all recognize, which is that there's nothing particularly age-dependent about any of this, that as William Blake says, neither youth nor childhood is folly or incapacity. Some children are fools, and so are some old men, including the one in the picture. We all know that there are plenty of 30 and 40-year-olds who make very foolish decisions about their medical care. Most pediatricians have taken care of 14 and 15-year-olds who seem to be wise beyond their years. And so right off the bat, I think we need to recognize that age alone will never be a sufficient means of sort of judging the capacity of an adolescent to assist in decision-making in their own care. However, our current approach does make the following assumptions. First, that as a general rule, the legal system at any rate, assumes that those under the age of 18 are incompetent. We all recognize that those individuals possess some degree of developing capacity, and that the more mature they become, the older they become, the more likely they are to have achieved what's necessary to make mature decisions. We also recognize that capacity is somewhat relative, that there are decisions that 7-year-olds are perfectly capable of making, like what color popsicle would you like, or what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, and there are decisions that 7-year-olds are not capable of making, and complex medical decisions might be treated differently than simple medical decisions. Finally, the developmental evidence that most pediatric bioethics people have relied on to sort of make decisions about when an adolescent is most likely to be able to make decisions has suggested that something about the age of 14 or 15 is the point at which an adolescent has achieved something that looks very similar to adult decision-making capacity, and that there's variability below that age. So our typical approach has been to ask, first of all, whether an adolescent is emancipated under the law, because if they're emancipated under the law, they in general have the ability to make decisions for themselves. Secondly, we ask the question that was asked in Daniel Hauser's case, which is, and in Dennis Lindberg's case, which is this adolescent a mature minor? Do they have sufficient maturity and capacity to make adult-level decisions that should be respected, perhaps no matter what their parents have to say or no matter what caretakers have to say? And then finally, if they don't have sufficient capacity to make this decision, to have their own decision respected, we look carefully at the parents' decision for these kids. In other words, if we chose not to respect Dennis Lindberg's case, we would still have to deal with the fact that his legal decision maker supported his decision and need some justification for overriding her decision. And that justification usually falls back on what's known as the harm principle. In other words, we ask whether the decision of the caretaker, let's say Dennis Lindberg's aunt, is placing Dennis at significant risk of serious harm. I would suggest that in Dennis Lindberg's case, had he not been declared a mature minor, it would have been reasonable to say that the decision his aunt was making at that point to deprive him of a blood transfusion did place him at significant risk of serious harm and could have been overridden by a judge. Now, what I want to point out is that with this sort of construct that we use in making decisions about adolescence, we do focus on establishing capacity through an assessment of rational faculties. And that assessment of rational faculties is largely a reflection of our reliance on the principle of autonomy. To give another example of how this plays out, in Britain they use very commonly use what's known as the Gillick test. And the Gillick test basically says that a young person under 16 years of age who, quote unquote, achieves a sufficient understanding and intelligence to enable him or her to understand fully what is proposed is competent to consent to medical treatment without parental consent. And therefore, and along with that, a competent refusal would also be respected. And what I want you to notice here is the similarities between the Gillick test and what we do in this country, which is the focus on understanding, the focus on rational capacities. In the United States, our traditional approach has been something like the rule of sevens. Some people use the rule of eights, and I'm not going to argue about what the numbers should be, but as a general rule, many people use something like this as a starting point, making the argument that those under 7 have no capacity to make any decision with any sort of degree of seriousness. Those over the age of 14, in general, because of the developmental evidence that suggests that they are capable of understanding information related to medical decisions, and because they do have rational faculties that look very adult-like, should be respected unless there's evidence to the contrary. And finally, between 7 and 14, there's a presumption of incapacity, but that may be overridden in rare cases where you can demonstrate the ability of them to make these rational decisions and understand what's at stake. Again, this is our traditional approach. The problem, as Dr. Medina alluded to, is the following. We know several things about adolescents that seem to stray from this sort of traditional approach we've taken. The first of which is that even though when you look at adolescents developmentally, you put them through tests and decision-making tasks in a sterile laboratory-type environment, they look an awful lot like adults. We know that in real life, adolescents often don't perform at a level commensurate with their cognitive abilities. Secondly, we know that middle adolescents are more likely than younger adolescents to rely on analytic processing, but this is not their primary means of decision making. And finally, middle and older adolescents have the ability to make adult-level decisions. In other words, they in some sense possess capacity or competence, but they frequently don't use that ability. In other words, they don't maximize the use of those abilities. What I want to say here is that our traditional approach relies on the fact that adolescents are capable of making these sorts of decisions. But what the data would suggest is that they frequently don't use those capabilities. And that, in some ways, sets them apart from adults. And again, there's a continuum and a spectrum here that's important. So to use another example, there is some interesting work that's been done with adolescents who have desired and in some cases obtained cosmetic surgery, not to correct defects, but to enhance their appearance. And one of these studies has discovered some very interesting things. First of all age groups, teens are most likely to be dissatisfied with their appearance. Not surprising. Satisfaction improves with age and peaks at 18 years of age. Adolescent body image is continually developing. Adolescents are very sensitive to how others look and what others think. And finally, body image and attitudes change as they approach adulthood. In other words, what studies like this have shown is that whereas a 15 or 16-year-old adolescent may have a very strong feeling that they need their nose fixed or that they need their breasts enhanced or they need some other kind of cosmetic surgery, if you take that same adolescent, put them off until they're 18, they frequently change their minds. In other words, there's reason to question the authenticity of some of the decisions that adolescents make, even if they appear to understand the consequences of those decisions, and even if they appear to be rational decisions. So our traditional approach has some shortcomings. It assumes autonomy is the proper paradigm. Autonomy in the sense of assessing capacity, assessing understanding, and then granting decision-making authority if somebody possesses that. Secondly, most data is based on the evaluation of reasoning, understanding, and in that sense, as I've mentioned, middle and older adolescents look similar to adults. But again, that's because our focus has been on this notion of rationality. Unfortunately, most of those studies that look at cognitive assessments do not account for emotional and psychosocial contributors to decision-making, factors that play a more prominent role in middle and older adolescents than perhaps they do in those same individuals when they become adults. The other problem with some of this data, and much of this data actually, is that it's based on situations that are not real. In other words, there are scenarios that are posed to adolescents, and they're asked to respond to those, and then their responses are measured against adult responses to similar scenarios. And I would suggest that data based on situations that don't mimic the context of real-life decisions, in other words, the emotional and other surroundings that occur, for example, in a real medical decision, is very different than one that's put on paper and presented to an adolescent. When Dennis Lindberg is making decisions about what to do about his new leukemia, there are emotional circumstances that would just simply not apply if I presented a group of 16-year-olds with a scenario about what would you do if you had leukemia with a 70% chance of survival. And so many of the ways we've measured adolescent capacity do not really recognize the fact that there is this very strong emotional element to adolescent decision-making. So let me talk about the adolescent brain a little bit, and I'm going to do this in a much more simplistic manner than Dr. Medina did, because I knew he would bring us down to the molecular level, and now I'm going to present a very simplistic way of thinking about this that will drive John nuts, but which I understand. Many people have suggested that we all, not just adolescents, but we all have two basic brain systems. Now again, this is grossly simplistic. We don't have two brain systems. But one way of thinking about the brain is that there are these two sort of basic systems that work together and are well integrated, but nonetheless, they exist in tandem. And there's a rich literature that supports this, and it goes beyond sort of the medical literature and the neurodevelopmental literature, and it extends into survival literature and psychosocial literature and social psychology and lots of others. And what's exciting about that is that all these different disciplines have more or less come to the same conclusion if you look carefully at their data. Which is that largely, for everybody, for the most part, when we make decisions, there's a balance between two things going on in our brain. The first of which is that we're trying to use rationality to come to some notion of what we should do in a situation. And the second is that emotional elements play a huge role in that. What we find in survival situations, for example, is that people's initial response is often a very emotional one. And frequently, survival is dependent on them surviving that emotional response. Now, as John pointed out, that emotional response is often evolutionarily adaptive for the most part, but it can also cause major problems when it isn't sort of reined in by the rational aspects of the brain. And what we find in survival situations is frequently the people who survive are the ones that are able to control that initial emotional response that may have gotten them out of immediate danger, but now is going to put them into bigger danger if they don't get some handle on it. Both of these systems have great value. but either one can mislead. And so it's a balance that we're actually trying to achieve. The emotional system, as it turns out, is most adaptive for humans living in small communities like we did back in Africa. And it's very individual responsive, it's crisis-driven, it's less utilitarian than a rational-based response. An example of these two systems is the often cited case of Phineas Gage. Phineas was a worker now I think almost 100 years ago, who had the unfortunate occurrence of having an explosion occur and ending up with a large metal pipe going through his brain. This is actually Phineas Gage's skull. The picture on the right there is his actual skull. You can see the hole in his skull. It's been reconstructed. And you can see the computer models that show where this bar went. Now, what's important about where this bar went is it essentially took out his prefrontal cortex. And Phineas Gage somehow remarkably remained conscious with this bar in his head and survived this incident, had the bar removed, and had very little sort of immediately noticeable effects of this significant brain image. But the one thing that was noted by everybody who knew Phineas was that Phineas Gage was no longer Phineas Gage. He was capable of rational thought. He could accomplish the sorts of things that rationality requires on a regular basis as effectively as he could before his accident. But Phineas Gage was socially a nightmare, in much the same way that some adolescents can be socially a nightmare. He lost his inhibitions, he became a risk taker, and he displayed a lot of the sort of same traits we see in adolescents, except probably to the third or fourth degree. Another way of understanding this is in terms of the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. The Scarecrow is caring but brainless. The Scarecrow has an emotional brain. The Tin Man is cerebral but needs a heart. You put the two of these together and you have the intact brain, which has both its emotional equipment and its rational equipment. Now let's talk about the emotional brain. The emotional brain, and I'm not going to talk about what elements these are, because if you're like me, you're not even going to know what I'm talking about if I talk about most people know what the prefrontal cortex is, but if I go beyond that and start talking about the amygdala, for example, you're going to be going, what the hell? I will use the amygdala term once or twice, and I use it with my daughter much of the time that I'm with her. But the emotional brain, which does involve the amygdala, picks up patterns before we're often consciously aware of them. And I've seen this in my own life. One of the most striking experiences I've ever had was hiking in Southern California and being off in La La Land. Oftentimes when I get into a rhythm on a hike, I'm totally off in another world. And at a certain point in that hike, I found myself without any full awareness of what was going on, doing what was probably the longest long jump of my life. And it was only after I had landed and turned around that I realized I had just leaped over a coiled rattlesnake. What was remarkable to me is that I had no awareness that what was happening was that I was jumping over a rattlesnake. It was completely occurring at an unconscious level. That was my amygdala, and that's what neurobiologists will tell you, that there was pattern recognition that occurred at some primitive aspect of my brain. It was recognized as danger. My amygdala caused epinephrine and cortisol to shoot into my system. I performed an Olympic-quality athletic event, and it saved my life. And it was only after turning around that my cortex actually got engaged and said what just happened and figured out what just happened. Had I relied on my cortex in that case, it would have operated too slowly to help anything. And my only hope would have been that my boot coming down would have crushed the snake's head before it had a chance to bite me. But that's what would have occurred without that sort of reptilian part of the brain that acts at a very emotional level. Those parts of the brain motivate behavior change through feelings and autonomic responses. It often explains our first impressions to intense situations, and it's often based on what Malcolm Gladwell in Blink calls thin slice data. It doesn't bother to gather lots of information. It acts on that first piece of information. And those of you who have adolescents know that you can see this in your kids all the time. My daughter frequently, you say one thing, and before you can say anything else about the sort of to fill in all the details, she's reacting like a maniac to that one piece of information she's gotten. And it takes the next half an hour to sort of bring her down so you can explain there's other information here that will actually attenuate the disaster that I've just broken to you. Now, those of you who are more philosophically inclined will recognize that human Kant actually reflected this sort of dichotomy of the brain, with Kant making the claim that core moral judgments arise from immediate aversive reaction to perceived or imagined harms to victims because of our emotional reaction to them, and Kant claiming that core moral judgments can be justified by pure reason alone with no help from emotion. And I would argue that they were both right, and that the reason that there was this so-called disagreement between Hume and Kant is that neither recognized that the brain is more complicated than either being a rational piece of equipment or an emotional piece of equipment. So, what can we say about adolescent brain development? It's not fully matured until the mid-20s, and John mentioned that. It's not actually, most of the data shows that until you're 29 or 30, you don't have actually a mature brain. And so when we talk about adolescence, we might more appropriately be talking about moving into the mid-20s. Maturation tends to occur back to front. In other words, it's the more rational parts of the brain, those like the prefrontal cortex, that mature the latest. And I might add that male maturation is not as quick as female maturation, so that 18-year-old girls are actually much more mature than 18-year-old boys, and all one needs to do is look at fraternities to recognize that. There's an imbalance between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and other sort of emotional elements of the brain, and it's that imbalance that I want to talk about. So the prefrontal cortex, I don't have to spend a lot of time on this because John already mentioned what the prefrontal cortex does, but we know that it's involved with high-level reasoning. It's involved with all these aspects of rationality: impulse control, assessment of consequences, planning, organizing, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, setting priorities, the sorts of things that are important to decision-making but may not be reflected in sort of a sterile lab decision-making task. When you talk about the amygdala, in contrast to the prefrontal cortex, which in an intense situation is going to look at the situation, assess what needs to be done, and plan, the amygdala and the rest of the emotional brain tends to look at the situation, immediately generate an emotion or a feeling, which drives a reaction. And again, those of you with adolescents can see how this happened in your adolescence. They don't even sort of do the rational part. They hear, and immediately there's a response. And that's what's going on there. The best way I can think that this has been put is that the adolescent brain is a well-developed accelerator, but only a partly developed brake. And it's that partly developed brake that I'm going to suggest has implications for how much we respect decision-making in adolescence. So what are the implications? I think the way I would summarize this is that adolescents have what I would call PFCDD, prefrontal cortex deficit disorder. They're often impulsive, inflexible, aggressive, reckless, emotionally volatile, risk-taking, reactive to stress, vulnerable to peer pressure. They respond to short-term rewards. They are very moved by excitement and arousal, underestimate long-term consequences, and overlook alternatives, all of which can impair decision-making tasks. In summary, as I've mentioned, there's an imbalance in adolescence, if you want to think of it that way, between the prefrontal cortex and the rational aspects of the brain and the subcortical areas, at least early on in adolescent development. That makes adolescents very sensitive to environmental cues, to affective elements, to rewards and punishments. Their brains are very good at decision-making tasks, but their brains are not necessarily good at making decisions in the heat of the moment, when emotion may be reigning. Decisions may weigh current rewards and feelings at the expense of future implications. So adolescents are capable of making rational decisions, but they're less likely to do so under certain conditions, like those where there is high emotion, where there's intense pressure, or where there's some degree of peer pressure. They're more likely to act impulsively without a full consideration of consequences, and psychosocial and emotional contributors may interact in ways that actually undermine authentic decision-making. So I'm going to suggest that there's an alternative to having an autonomy-based way of thinking about adolescent decision-making. For younger adolescents, autonomy clearly doesn't seem to apply. There's a failure to recognize damage done by not, but we also need to recognize that we can do damage by not respecting them. In other words, I'm not going to say we just override adolescent decision-making because they're not autonomous, but we need to be careful about considering them autonomous for the reasons I've mentioned. For older adolescents, a focus on autonomy uses traditional standards of informed consent like understanding and information gathering, but that focuses on rational faculties to the exclusion of the emotional elements that may impact their decision in adverse ways. So I would suggest that we reframe the notion of respect for autonomy and think more in terms of respect for persons when we're talking about adolescence. The issues with Dennis Lindberg and Daniel Hauser, in my mind, revolve more around whether they have the autonomy to make these decisions, whether they should be declared mature minors, and more related to what it means to respect them as developing persons who may have some impaired decision-making. Dennis Lindberg said he was a Jehovah's Witness. One of my concerns about the decision-making in Lindberg's case was that we know that adolescents at his age are very prone to peer pressure and what their social system finds okay. And when your identity is as a Jehovah's Witness and all of your peers are saying this is what you should do, it's not clear to me that Dennis can make an authentic decision that he would hold to 7 years later in his mid-20s. That's one of the things that concerns me about declaring him a mature minor and respecting his decision. So I think we need to think in terms of respect for persons and the principle of beneficence and think about what it means to respect an adolescent. And I would say that among other things, it means involving them in decisions and discussions. It means recognizing that they have developing capacity, but that capacity may be limited, particularly by these emotional elements that may infuse decisions. That we should recognize that even at 17, their decision-making may be affected in ways that make them different than adults in making decisions. And I would say even at 24 and 25. And we should recognize the kinds of situations in which decision-making should be or might be flawed, which includes those where there's a high level of emotion, where there's a high level of pressure from peers and that sort of thing. So adolescents may need limits within some limits, and I'll talk about what those limits are. So when we think about adolescents, we need to involve more than age in our thinking. We need to think about more than their ability to reason, and we need to think about more than their ability to understand what we've just told them. We need to recognize that their decisions are driven by short-term consequences, the here and now, and less about what this means for 5 years from now. Prior lived experience with illness and treatment may impact that, so I may be more inclined to respect a 16-year-old who's making a decision when they've battled with cystic fibrosis their entire life. There's less of an emotional element involved there because this is sort of their life. It's not something new. It's not a new diagnosis of leukemia or Ewing sarcoma. We need to recognize that their ability to project meaningfully into the future may be limited. That they don't have settled values and beliefs. When a 14-year-old says, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, it doesn't mean they're going to be a Jehovah's Witness when they're 21. And we know for a fact that many adolescents do, in fact, change their values and their religious beliefs and other things between the age of 14, 15, and 16 and the time they're more mature adults. Finally, I would suggest that the practicality of treatment is a factor that often gets underrated, but we need to think very strongly about. Why is that? Because I would suggest that the one way that we show incredible disrespect for any individual, whether they have capacity or not, is to force them to do things, particularly to use physical force to force them to do things. In that sense, I think the judge made the right decision in Daniel Hauser's case by saying to Daniel Hauser and his family, you have to get treated, you have to have a chest x-ray, and you have to do what your doctor says. But what I would have advised his medical team to do is be very, very careful about using any physical restraint to accomplish that. Most of the time, it's sufficient for a judge to say you have to do this. And in that sense, I think the judge did the right thing. But when you have somebody who's going to need 3 years of treatment and who is physically resisting every part of the way, I think we have to strongly consider the kind of harm we're doing in forcing that child, whether we consider them mature enough or not to make this decision, to have to undergo what we have suggested they undergo. That's a beneficence consideration, and that's probably where we ought to be thinking about those sorts of things more clearly. In other words, we seek to do good when we treat somebody, for example, for cancer with a 70% survival rate, but we also have to recognize that in accomplishing that, we can do a great deal of harm, and that becomes an important part of these equations. So I'll stop there.